You don't notice the moment you start losing yourself. There's no alarm, no clear line that you cross. It happens quietly, in conversations where you almost say what you think, but stop at the last second. In moments where you feel something strongly, but choose to soften it, dilute it, reshape it, just enough to be accepted. And at first, it feels harmless, even smart. You tell yourself, I'm just being adaptable. I'm just being easy to deal with. I'm just avoiding unnecessary conflict. But what you don't see is that every time you choose approval over truth, you make a small withdrawal from your own identity. And the dangerous part is, it works. People like you. They find you pleasant, agreeable, comfortable to be around. You become the kind of person who doesn't create tension, who doesn't challenge too much, who doesn't make others uncomfortable. And slowly, that becomes your role. Not who you are, but who you've learned to be. And the more you play that role, the harder it becomes to step out of it. Because now, there's something at stake. If you change, if you speak differently, if you stop being who they expect, what happens? Will they still like you? Will they still stay? And that question starts to control you. So you keep adjusting, a little here, a little there, until one day, you feel something you can't quite explain. Not pain, not sadness, but a kind of emptiness, a subtle disconnection, like you're present, but not fully there, like you're living your life from slightly outside yourself. And that's when it begins to surface. The realization that being liked has come at a cost. Because the version of you that people accept is not entirely real. It's curated, filtered, edited, built carefully to avoid rejection. And here's the truth most people spend their entire lives avoiding. The more you try to be liked, the more you train yourself to abandon the parts of you that might not be. Your honesty, your intensity, your contradictions, your raw, unpolished truth. All slowly pushed aside, not because they're wrong, but because they're risky. And over time, you stop asking, who am I? And start asking, who do I need to be so I won't be rejected? And that shift changes everything. Because now, you're no longer living from identity. You're living from strategy. Every word becomes calculated. Every reaction becomes measured. Every expression becomes filtered. Not to express yourself, but to maintain approval. And the longer you live like this, the more invisible you become to yourself. Until one day, you realize something unsettling. You don't know who you are, without other people's expectations shaping you. And that's where this journey begins. Not in rejection, not in pain, but in awareness. The awareness that somewhere along the way, you traded authenticity for acceptance. And now, something inside you wants it back. It didn't start with insecurity. It started with survival. Long before you became aware of yourself, before you had opinions, identity, direction, you had one fundamental need: to belong. Because as a human being, belonging was never optional. It meant safety. It meant protection. It meant survival. And your mind learned that very quickly. As a child, you began to notice something subtle. When you behaved in certain ways, you were rewarded with attention, with approval, with affection. And when you didn't, something changed. The tone, the energy, the connection. It didn't always mean rejection, but it felt like the possibility of it. And that was enough. So your mind did what it was designed to do. It adapted. You started observing. What makes me accepted? What makes people respond positively to me? What makes me liked? And without realizing it, you began to build patterns. Patterns of behavior, patterns of expression, patterns of identity. Not based on who you are, but based on what works. And this is where something important happens. Your brain starts associating approval with reward. Every time someone validates you, agrees with you, accepts you, there's a small release inside your system. A sense of relief, a sense of confirmation. I'm okay, I'm safe, I belong. And your mind remembers that. It stores it, and then it seeks it again. Because from a psychological perspective, approval becomes a form of reinforcement. So you repeat the behaviors that generate acceptance. You refine them, you strengthen them, you depend on them. And slowly, what was once a natural social adjustment becomes something deeper. A dependency. Because now, you're not just enjoying being liked, you're relying on it to feel stable, to feel secure, to feel enough. And this is where the trap closes. Because the moment your sense of worth depends on external feedback, you lose internal grounding. Now your emotional state becomes reactive. If people respond well, you feel good. If they don't, something inside you destabilizes. And the worst part is, you start anticipating that instability. You begin to think ahead, to calculate, to adjust before anything even happens. You don't wait to see if you'll be rejected. You act in ways that prevent the possibility of it. And this creates a constant internal tension, because you're no longer living in the present. You're living in projection, imagining reactions, predicting judgments, avoiding outcomes that may never even exist. And all of this, just to maintain a feeling that was never stable to begin with. Because here's the truth. Approval is inconsistent. People change, contexts change, expectations change. What makes you liked in one environment might make you rejected in another. So what do? You adapt again, you shift again. You become flexible, adjustable, moldable, until your identity becomes something fluid, but not in a healthy way. In a fragmented way. Because now, you're not grounded in who you are. You're shaped by where you are and who you're with. And that creates something subtle, but deeply exhausting. You are constantly managing yourself, monitoring your words, filtering your reactions, adjusting your presence, always asking, is this okay? Is this acceptable? Will this make me liked? And the more you do this, the more disconnected you become from your natural state. Because your natural state is not calculated, it's spontaneous, it's real, and real is unpredictable, which is exactly what your conditioned mind is trying to avoid. So it keeps you in control, in strategy, in performance, because performance feels safer than authenticity. But here's the cost. The more you rely on approval, the less you trust yourself. Because your decisions are no longer coming from within, they're coming from outside, from imagined reactions, from anticipated judgments, from the need to maintain a certain image. And over time, you lose something essential, your internal compass. That quiet sense of knowing, this is me, this is what I think, this is what I feel, without needing confirmation, without needing agreement, without needing to be liked. And once that compass is lost, you become vulnerable, not to rejection, but to influence. Because now, anyone's opinion can shape you, anyone's reaction can affect you, anyone's approval can control you. And that's when being liked stops being a preference and becomes a necessity. An addiction. Not because you want it, but because you don't feel stable without it. And breaking that addiction requires something uncomfortable. You have to face the very thing your mind has been trying to avoid all along. Rejection. Not intellectually, but emotionally. Because until you understand why rejection feels so threatening, you will continue reorganizing your entire identity to avoid it. And that's exactly where we're going next. At some point, you stopped just adapting and started becoming the version of yourself that works. The version that avoids friction, that earns approval, that keeps things smooth, predictable, acceptable. And the shift is so subtle, you don't even notice when it happens. Because at first, it feels like control, like maturity, like social intelligence. You know how to behave, you know what to say, you know how to navigate people. You've learned the rules, unspoken, but powerful. Don't be too intense. Don't be too different. Don't say things that might create discomfort. Stay within the range of what's acceptable, and you'll be fine. And you are. On the surface, everything works. People like you, respect you, include you. You've become someone who fits, but fitting has a hidden cost. Because to fit, you had to shape yourself. Not completely, but enough. Enough to smooth the edges, enough to soften the truth, enough to hide the parts that might disrupt the image. And over time, that shaping becomes identity. Not something you do, but something you are. This is the mask. Not something fake in an obvious way, but something constructed, carefully, repeatedly, until it feels natural, until it feels real. And that's the danger. Because once the mask feels real, you stop questioning it. You stop noticing the difference between what you truly feel and what you allow yourself to express. You stop asking, is this me? And start assuming. But deep down, there are moments, small ones, where something doesn't align, a reaction you hold back, a thought you don't say, a feeling you suppress. And in those moments, there's a quiet tension, almost unnoticeable, but persistent, because something in you knows, this isn't all of me. But you ignore it, because the mask works. It protects you. It gives you access to connection, to approval, to belonging. And letting go of it feels risky. Because if the mask is what people accept, then who are you without it? And more importantly, will that version of you still be accepted? So you keep it. You refine it. You become even better at it, more controlled, more consistent. Until one day, you realize something unsettling. You don't know where the mask ends, and you begin. Because the more you perform something, the more it integrates. Not as truth, but as habit. And habits feel natural, even when they're not authentic. So now you don't just wear the mask socially. You wear it internally. You question your own reactions. You adjust yourself, even when no one is watching. And that's when the mask stops being a tool and becomes a prison. Because now, you're not just hiding from others, you're hiding from yourself. And that creates a deep disconnection. You lose access to your raw thoughts, your spontaneous reactions, your unfiltered truth. Everything becomes processed, measured, controlled. And while that gives you stability on the outside, it creates emptiness on the inside. Because there's no space for you to actually exist. Only space for the version of you that is allowed. And here's the most dangerous part. The more people validate the mask, the harder it becomes to remove it. Because now, it's not just your identity, it's your social currency. It's how you maintain relationships, how you avoid conflict, how you stay connected. So even if you feel the disconnection, even if you sense something is missing, you hesitate. Because removing the mask means facing uncertainty, means risking rejection, means stepping into the unknown. And most people choose the mask, not because they want to be fake, but because they're afraid of what might happen if they're real. So they stay in the role, in the performance, in the identity that was built, not discovered. And life continues, functional, stable, acceptable. But something inside you remains untouched, unexpressed, unlived. And over time, that becomes impossible to ignore. Because no matter how well the mask works, it can never replace what's real. It can only cover it. And what is covered doesn't disappear. It waits. And eventually, it begins to push back. Through discomfort, through frustration, through a growing sense that something is missing. Not externally, but internally. And that's where the next layer reveals itself. Because everything you've been hiding, everything you've been suppressing to maintain the mask, doesn't stay silent. Something deeper. Something powerful. Something that begins to influence you. From the shadows, there's a part of you that never disappeared. No matter how much you adjusted, how much you filtered, how much you became who others expected, it stayed. Quiet, waiting. Everything you pushed aside to be accepted, everything that didn't fit the image, everything that felt too much, too intense, too real, didn't vanish. It went somewhere, beneath the surface, outside your awareness, and from there, it began to grow. Because what you suppress doesn't weaken, it accumulates. Your anger that you learned to hide so you wouldn't seem difficult, your opinions that you silenced so you wouldn't create tension, your needs that you ignored so you wouldn't be too much, your boundaries that you softened so people wouldn't leave. All of it, stored, compressed, unexpressed. And over time, it becomes something else. Not just hidden, but active. This is your shadow. Not just the dark parts of you, but the rejected parts of you, the parts you decided were not acceptable. And here's where it becomes dangerous. Because the shadow doesn't ask for permission, it doesn't wait for the right moment, it doesn't care about your image. It expresses itself, whether you're aware of it or not. At first, subtly. A slight irritation that feels stronger than it should. A reaction that surprises you. A thought that slips out before you can filter it. And you pause, confused. That's not like me. But it is. It's just not the version of you allow yourself to see. The more pressure builds, because now you're not just maintaining a mask, you're containing everything that doesn't fit it. And containment requires energy. Constant energy. You have to control yourself, monitor yourself, hold things back, again and again, until one day, you can't. And when the shadow finally breaks through, it doesn't come out gently. It comes out distorted. Explosive anger, sudden withdrawal, self-sabotaging decisions. Moments where you act in ways that don't match the identity you've been trying to maintain. And afterward, you feel it. Regret, confusion, discomfort. You think, why did I do that? Where did that come from? But the answer is simple. It came from everything you refused to face. Because the shadow doesn't disappear. It waits for expression. And if you don't give it a conscious voice, it will take control unconsciously. That's why people who try the hardest to be nice, perfect, liked, often feel the most internal tension. Because they are constantly at war with themselves, managing what is allowed and suppressing what is not. And that creates a split, a divide between the version of you that is accepted and the version of you that is real. And the wider that gap becomes, the more unstable you feel. Because you are no longer whole, you are divided. And division creates pressure. You feel it in your body, in your thoughts, in your reactions. A constant undercurrent of something unresolved, but being pushed back down, again and again and again, until it finds another way out. Through projection. You begin to judge others for the very things you've suppressed in yourself. You call someone too aggressive because you've buried your own assertiveness. You feel uncomfortable around someone confident because you've denied your own desire to stand out. You criticize honesty because you're afraid of expressing your own. And without realizing it, the world becomes a mirror, reflecting back everything you refuse to see within. And that creates even more tension. Because now, it's not just internal, it's everywhere. But here's the truth that changes everything. The problem is not your shadow. The problem is your rejection of it. Because the shadow is not your enemy. It's a part of you that never had the chance to be integrated. It holds your intensity, your truth, your power, everything that was too inconvenient to express, but too important to disappear. And the moment you stop running from it, everything begins to shift. Not because it disappears, but because it becomes conscious. And once something is conscious, it no longer controls you. You can feel anger without exploding. You can have boundaries without guilt. You can express truth without losing yourself. Because now, you are not suppressing parts of who you are integrating them. And integration is what creates stability. Not perfection, not control, but wholeness, without dividing yourself to be accepted. But here's the cost. Because once you stop suppressing yourself, once you start allowing all parts of you to exist, something inevitable happens. Not everyone will like it. Not everyone will stay. And that's where the next transformation begins. There's a moment in this process where things start to change. Not internally, you've already felt that shift. Not in awareness, you already see more clearly. But externally, in your relationships. Because the moment you stop performing, the moment you stop adjusting yourself for approval, the moment you begin to act from something real, people notice. Not always consciously, but they feel it. Your energy changes, your responses change, your presence changes. You're no longer as predictable, no longer as easy to read, no longer as easy to control. And that's where the tension begins. Because the version of you that people were used to was stable, comfortable, familiar. They knew how you would react. They knew what to expect. They knew the role you played in their lives. But now, that version is shifting. And not everyone knows how to deal with that. Some people will question it. You've changed. You're different lately. What happened to you? And it won't always be said with curiosity. Sometimes, it will carry discomfort. Because your growth challenges their expectations. And expectations are what many relationships are built on. Unspoken agreements. You act this way, I act that way, and everything works. But when one side changes, the agreement breaks. And that creates instability. So what happens? Some people adapt. They adjust. They try to understand. They meet you at your new level of honesty. But others can't. Not because they're bad, but because the version of you they connected with no longer exists. And they don't know how to relate to who you're becoming. So they pull away. Sometimes slowly, sometimes suddenly. But noticeably. The conversations lose depth. The connection feels distant. The effort fades. And this is the moment that tests you. Because your instinct will be to think, maybe I should go back. Maybe I was better before. Maybe being real is costing me too much. And that thought is seductive. Because going back feels easy, familiar, safe. You know how to be liked. You've mastered it. You can return to that version at any time. But here's the truth you can't ignore anymore. Going back means abandoning yourself again. It means choosing connection over truth. Approval over alignment. That choice becomes heavier. Because you know the cost. You felt it. That quiet disconnection. That internal emptiness. That subtle sense of not being fully there. So the question becomes unavoidable. Is keeping these connections worth losing yourself again? And for the first time, you hesitate. Because something in you has changed. Something in you no longer wants to shrink just to be accepted. So you stay. In the discomfort. In the uncertainty. In the space where some people begin to leave. Yes, it hurts. Not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, persistent way. You miss what was familiar. You miss the ease. You miss the feeling of being effortlessly accepted. But at the same time, there's something new. A sense of alignment. A sense that, even in the discomfort, you are finally being honest with yourself. And that honesty creates a different kind of strength. Not loud, not visible, but solid. Because for the first time, your connections are no longer based on performance. They're based on truth. And that changes everything. Because the people who stay now are not staying for the mask. They're staying for you. The real you. Unfiltered, unadjusted, unnegotiated. And those connections feel different, deeper, more stable. But they are fewer. And that's the part most people struggle with. Because we've been conditioned to believe that more connection is better, more approval is better, more acceptance is better. But that's not true. Because connection without authenticity is just proximity. And approval without truth is empty. So as your world becomes smaller, it also becomes clearer. You start to see who truly resonates, who truly understands, who truly connects. Not with your mask, but with your essence. And that clarity is worth every loss. But to fully step into that, you have to let go of one final illusion. The belief that being liked, is what gives you value. Because as long as that belief exists, you will always be tempted to go back, to perform, to adjust, to become acceptable again. And breaking that illusion is what finally sets you free. Not just to be liked, but to stay liked. You become more careful, more strategic, more aware of how you're perceived. Because losing that validation feels like losing something important. But what you're actually losing was never stable to begin with. Because approval is conditional. It depends on context, on timing, on personal preferences. Someone can like you today and not resonate with you tomorrow. And if your worth is tied to that, then your sense of self becomes unstable, fragile, easily influenced. And here's the deeper problem. Even when people like you, it still doesn't feel like enough. Because something inside you knows they're not seeing all of you. They're seeing the version you've chosen to show, the adjusted version, the filtered version, the acceptable version. So even when validation comes, it doesn't fully land, because it's not reaching your real self. And that creates a subtle emptiness, a feeling of being appreciated, but not truly known. And that emptiness leads you to seek even more validation, hoping that eventually it will feel complete. But it never does. Because the problem is not the amount of validation, it's the source of your worth. You've placed it outside of yourself, in something unstable, in something inconsistent, in something that was never meant to define you. And as long as that continues, you will always feel like something is missing. No matter how many people like you, no matter how much approval you receive. Cannot replace self-recognition. It cannot give you a stable sense of identity. It can only reflect what you show. And if what you show is not fully real, then what you receive will never feel fully satisfying. This is why people can be surrounded by approval and still feel empty. Because they are not connected to themselves. They are connected to reactions. And reactions are temporary. They come and go. But your relationship with yourself is constant. And that's where real stability comes from. Not from being liked, but from being aligned. Aligned with what you think, aligned with what you feel, aligned with who you are, without needing external confirmation. And once that alignment begins to form, something changes. You still appreciate being liked, but you no longer depend on it. You still value connection, but you no longer sacrifice yourself for it. You still listen to feedback, but you are no longer defined by it. Because your center is no longer external. It's internal. And from that place, a different kind of confidence emerges. Not loud, not performative, but steady, grounded, independent of how others perceive you. And that is what breaks the illusion. The realization that being liked is not the same as being whole. And once you see that clearly, you stop chasing validation and start building something far more powerful. A relationship with yourself that doesn't require constant approval to exist. There's a final shift, and it doesn't come from understanding. It comes from decision. Because at some point, you already see everything clearly. You understand the mask, you recognize the patterns, you feel the cost of living for approval. And you've tasted something different. Moments where you were real, unfiltered, unaligned with expectations, but aligned with yourself. And now, you stand between two ways of living. One is familiar, safe, predictable, accepted. A life where you are liked, but not fully known. Where you belong, but only as the version of you that fits. The other is uncertain, uncomfortable, uncontrolled, unpredictable. A life where you are real, but not always accepted. Where you are seen, but not always understood. And the difference between these two paths comes down to one thing: courage. Not the loud kind, not the kind that makes noise or demands attention, but the quiet kind. The kind that shows up in moments no one sees. When you choose to say what you actually think, even if it creates tension. When you choose to express what you actually feel, even if it changes how someone sees you. When you choose to stand in your truth without reshaping it for comfort. That is courage, and it doesn't feel powerful at first. It feels exposed. Because for the first time, there's no layer between you and the world. No filter, no protection, no adjustment, just you, as you are. And that means you risk being disliked, misunderstood, rejected. And this is the moment most people step back. Because everything in your conditioning says, don't do that, stay acceptable, stay safe, stay liked. But something deeper in you says something else, something quieter, but more real. Stay true. And the moment you choose that, everything changes. Not externally at first, but internally. You feel it. A sense of solidity. A sense that, regardless of what happens, you didn't abandon yourself. And that feeling is different from approval. Because approval comes from outside and disappears just as quickly. But this stays. It builds. Every time you choose yourself over perception, it strengthens. And slowly, you become someone who no longer negotiates their identity. Not out of arrogance, not out of resistance, but out of clarity. You understand that not everyone will like you, not everyone will agree with you, not everyone will stay, and that's no longer a problem to solve, it's a reality to accept. Because trying to be liked by everyone was never the goal, it was the strategy. A strategy you used to feel safe. But now, you don't need it the same way, because your safety is no longer dependent on acceptance, it's grounded in self-trust, and from that place, you interact differently. You don't enter rooms trying to win approval, you don't speak trying to control perception, you don't act trying to maintain an image. You simply show up, as you are, and that simplicity is powerful, because it removes the tension, the constant calculation. You're no longer performing, you're living. And yes, some people won't like it, some will misunderstand you, some will distance themselves, but others will finally see you. Not the mask, not the version you maintained, but you. And those connections will feel different, real, grounded, effortless, because they don't require you to be anything other than what you are. And that's what makes them valuable. Not their quantity, but their truth. So in the end, this was never about being liked, it was about being free. Free from the need to constantly adjust, free from the fear of disapproval, free from the belief that your worth depends on how you're perceived. And that freedom begins the moment you decide, I would rather be real than be liked, and live by it. Not perfectly, but consistently. Because every time you choose authenticity, you reclaim a part of yourself that was lost. And over time, there's nothing left to reclaim, because you are fully there, fully present, fully you. And hey, if you've been feeling stuck in emotional loops, struggling with inner conflict, or sensing there's a part of you you've never fully understood, you're not alone in that. This guide we've put together dives deep into exactly that. It'll help you understand why certain patterns keep repeating, face the hidden parts of yourself you've been avoiding, begin real emotional healing and self-integration, reconnect with your true, undiluted self. If any of that speaks to something you've been quietly carrying, check the first pinned comment under this video. It might be exactly what your soul has been needing. No pressure, no rush, just when you're ready.